All right. Um, this is a new thing we're trying with giving you some choice. If you feel like you need reading help, then you should be watching this video. If not, you can always watch it on your own. But this lesson is chapter 12, section 5 on American literature develops. So obviously America, literature is basically books, novels, short stories. So think of our great authors. This is where a lot of them actually come from, is right from this time period. Um, so this is where they start out. Okay, I'll read through the vocabulary and the questions just to build your background knowledge a little bit. First of all, the word bravery means the ability not to be afraid when facing danger. Classic, a book that has lasting value or meaning. All right, the questions. Which writers contributed to American literature? So it's going to be looking at the people, and this is one person. Novelist. So a novelist is a person that writes like a book or a fictional book. James Fenimore Cooper, the first great American novelist, wrote tales of adventure. Next vocabulary word, prose. The ordinary form of spoken or written language. So that's basically like the style of how things are written. Okay. And then a famous writer you may have heard of is Edgar Allan Poe. We'll be reading about him today. Another vocabulary, abolitionist, a person who wanted slavery stopped. So abolish, we had that before. That's to stop something or to get rid of it. So abolitionist is somebody that wanted to get rid of slavery. Which other writers attacked slavery? We'll be looking at that. And how did other countries view American literature? And then we're looking at our review questions. All right, let's get going. At first, colonists lived in America much as they had in Great Britain. They held on to the old customs that they had brought from their homeland. The South, the Western frontier, and New England were all different from Great Britain. Unlike the original colonists, many Americans did not care about the Great Britain of the past. During the 200 years between the settling of Jamestown and the election of President Jefferson, the nation had found its own culture. Writers and artists of that time period recorded life in America. Which writers contributed to American literature? Before this time, Benjamin Franklin was one of the few American writers whose works were popularly read. However, between 1815 and 1860, many writers described the America they knew in books, stories, and poems. Tales of adventure and bravery in the growing country became classics. A classic is a book that has lasting value or meaning. People all over the world began to take an interest in the spirit of this bold new land. James Fenimore Cooper wrote about the American Revolution and the French and Indian War. He also wrote about adventure on the high seas, the frontiers, and the plains. His best-known novels are the 5 Leatherstocking Tales. Some of these are The Last of the Mohicans, The Pioneers, and The Deer Slayer. One early American writer, Washington Irving, was successful with tales such as The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Rip Van Winkle. In 1851, Herman Melville wrote Moby Dick. Nathaniel Hawthorne published The Scarlet Letter, set in colonial times in 1850. Edgar Allan Poe wrote several frightening stories, including The Fall of the House of Usher in 1839 and The Murders in the Rue Morgue in 1841. Poe also wrote a number of poems such as The Raven. Some American poets wrote about the vast opportunity in America, while many attacked the serious problems in the country. Henry David Thoreau focused on the peace and beauty in nature. Walt Whitman wrote about freedom and those who fought for it. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote poetry and prose, including works such as Paul Revere's Ride and poems on slavery that looked at history and current events. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote about life and what it meant to be a human being. During this period, he became very active in the anti-slavery campaign. History in your life. Edgar Allan Poe. Many regard Edgar Allan Poe, 1809 to 1849, as one of the most brilliant original writers in American literature. Poe struggled to make a living during the 1830s and 1840s. He published his writings and worked as a magazine editor and critic. A complicated, troubled man, Poe is remembered for such eerie poems as The Raven and Annabel Lee. He is also remembered for short stories like The Fall of the House of Usher. Poe established a tradition of American horror stories. Filmmakers and writers like Stephen King carry on that tradition today. Poe is also considered one of the creators of the modern detective story. Examples of his detectives' stories are The Murders in the Rue Morgue and The Mask of the Red Death. Poe never enjoyed much commercial success from his writing. However, millions of people today enjoy reading his work. John Greenleaf Whittier had become an established writer. Mobs often attacked him because he was one of the people who started the American Anti-Slavery Society. So that's a group of people that is against slavery. Writers such as James Russell Lowell and Oliver Wendell Holmes also used their poetry to attack slavery, which they considered to be an evil practice. Which other writers attacked slavery? Several other writers helped to bring attention to the slavery issue during this time. Harriet Beecher Stowe of New England wrote a book called Uncle Tom's Cabin in 1852. She described the terrible conditions under which slaves had to live. Thousands of copies of the book were sold in the United States and in Europe. Uncle Tom's Cabin added to the movement to abolish slavery. In 1857, poor Southerner Hinton R. Helper wrote The Impending Crisis of the South. This book carried the message that the evil of slavery was ruining the South. He described the South as poor, especially due to its lack of industry. Its people were not educated and were far behind the rest of the country. This book upset a lot of people, especially those in the South. In 1831, William Lloyd Garrison published a newspaper called The Liberator. His point of view was clear: slavery must be stopped. Garrison was liked by some people, but others thought him to be too violent. Equally important were the contributions made by an ex-slave, Frederick Douglass. Douglass bought his freedom after escaping from Maryland. Douglass was self-taught and became an excellent speaker and writer. When he settled in Rochester, New York, Douglass published an anti-slavery newspaper called The North Star. Douglass tried to help in the fight against slavery through his speeches and writings. Both Garrison and Douglass were abolitionists. An abolitionist was a person who wanted slavery stopped or abolished. How did other countries view American literature? For many years after America was established, the Europeans did not view the nation as being well developed. European nations thought that a younger country could produce no great literature. However, by the middle of the 1800s, Americans were proving that their stories were rich and exciting. The United States was becoming a storyteller to the world. All right, first one, Moby Dick, was written by. Next, 2 wrote about peace and beauty in nature. 3, blank wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. A newspaper called The Liberator was published by. Blank published in an anti-slavery newspaper called The North Star. Those are pretty easy to find. Why do you think American literature is important? You should explain. You might talk about in this question because American literature has contributed to our culture, has contributed to a lot of movies that have been made, has been contributed to our economy, and has truly created a sense of how America feels about itself. All right, last thing. It happened in history. Transcendentalism. Isn't that a big word? Transcendentalism was an important movement in the United States during the mid-1800s to the early 1900s. Transcendentalists believed God was present in nature. They also believed that people could save themselves without organized religion. Leading transcendentalist Ralph Waldo Emerson taught that people should learn directly from life and inner reflection. The search for inner truth emphasized individual responsibility and self-reliance. Emerson and one of his students, Henry David Thoreau, spread their transcendental philosophy through their writings. Emerson strongly opposed slavery. Thoreau refused to pay taxes used for the Mexican War and was briefly sent to jail. Another transcendentalist, Margaret Fuller, is sometimes called America's first feminist. Feminist means somebody that fights for women's rights. Okay, that's it for the